this is a point you've made to me a number of times. I think it's right. She is a prosecutor. And that those folks do tend to see the world in terms of victims and perps. Their job is to go after the perps.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. And I'm delighted to welcome back my partner in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, who is Professor Emeritus of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair of Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Welcome back, world traveler from Svalbard.
The really big excitement in the Cohen household this week was we finally got our Medicare cards, which shows you that actually the bureaucracy does work, kind of. But the other thing was spending a week in Svalbard, bopping around the heaving oceans in a Norwegian Coast Guard cutter, and not being able to go outside without an armed guard because of the polar bears. I wanted to bring you back an armored polar bear, knowing that you're a fan of Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass, but they turn out to be a protected species. Although the truth is, we're the ones who need to be protected from them. They are not nice animals at all.
So what was the occasion for the trip? Was this you and Judy just going, for some, fun out of the way tourism, or was there actually
although tourists do go there. So the story is this. The Norwegian Ministry of Defense has a small annual workshop that for only about 20, 25 people, to which I was invited. The topics were the ones you might imagine. Russia.
I think some senior congressional staffers may have been invited too, because
and even a corporate figure or two.
Yeah, I know one of them because he was emailing me saying I'm in Svalbard, and I was going, I wonder what he's doing.
So, but a bunch of Nordics, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, French, German, Brit, extremely good former senior official from the Baltic states. It's all Chatham House rules, so I'm not going to name names. But very interesting discussions. I had actually gone over a day before, so I also had on top of all this meetings with some senior military people, with the Norwegian intelligence community and their foreign affairs think tank. But they wanted to take us to Svalbard. And Svalbard is, if you go look at it on the map, it is really like up there. So we got up to 79 degrees north latitude. So it's well above the Arctic Circle. It's hundreds of miles northwest of Norway. If you look at it from the point of view of a map which has the North Pole at its center, you really see why it's very important, because the Russians have this huge military complex on the Kola Peninsula, plus there's Nova Zemlya, which I think they did nuclear testing there.
Yes,
at one point.
Yes, they did.
But
they still do nuclear work there.
It's sort of hemmed in by Norway, by Svalbard, Greenland, and other things. So there's strategic interest. Plus, as the Arctic opens up, there could be of commercial significance. So they took us up there. We went to Longyearbyen, which is the roaring metropolis of some 2,900 souls. And then we piled into a Coast Guard cutter, a substantial ship with about 50, crew of, 55, 60 or more. And we cruised around the island, also known as Spitsbergen, and went to their Polar Research Center, which is really way up there, at a place called Ny-Ålesund, which has a couple hundred people in the summer, about 45 during the bleak winters. And the discussions were great. We were talking about Russia, as I mentioned. But also, I must say, it brought home to me the extent of climate change. Um, and it's not that I've not been a zealot on this one, but I have to say it shook me. So the average temperature has risen by, I think, 8 degrees over just the last 3 or 4 decades. The permafrost is melting, so they have to pick up these prefabricated houses and move them around. There's aerial photography of that area going back to the mid 30s, and you just see the glaciers like vanishing. Ice has gotten thinner. Some animal species have disappeared, others have moved in. It really very striking. And it's such an interesting piece of geography. The last day we went to this huge antenna farm that they have with these giant antennas and geodesic domes. I think like 160 antennas, because it's the ideal spot for low Earth orbit satellites, which go around 14 times a day, and they all pass over the North Pole. So you can download data 14 times a day. So that was fascinating. The legal status of the place is fascinating because it was basically nobody owned it until 1920. So it's now Norwegian territory, but demilitarized. And citizens of any country can go there. So there's a Russian like village of about 300 people who are coal miners. Both Russians and Chinese have scientific presences there. So the Norwegians keep a vigilant eye on it. There are no military, but there are robust Coast Guard and police presence. It's just fascinating, and it got me thinking about Arctic security in a way that I never would have. The main bottom line I'd say from the workshop was just how seriously not just the Baltic states, but the Nordic states take Russia as a threat, and the extent to which they really are preparing for the eventuality of real armed conflict. Each country is different, but even a country like Denmark is not where it was 3 years ago. They're very, very different. When you're just talking about their plans to expand the size of their armed forces and kind of the degree of societal consensus, I mean, it just reminded you of what a gap there is between these countries and, let's say, Poland, and of course all the Baltic states and places like Germany and France, where we've been seeing the rise of these right-wing and left-wing parties, both of which would like to abandon Ukraine and would like to walk away from rearmament.
So your comments remind me that one of the really, I think, underestimated strategic consequences of Putin's invasion of Ukraine was the very rapid change in Finnish and Swedish attitudes and their adhesion to NATO, which of course was held up by the Turks for a while, but ultimately they're now members. And one of the things I think that people have not appreciated is that as the Arctic does become a kind of, I wouldn't say cockpit because it's not quite the South China Sea yet, but I mean, there are there are clearly issues having to do with seafloor mining up there, rare earth metals. Both China and Russia have been active there. And so in the strategic competition over the Arctic, NATO having now access to the Barents and to the Arctic through Finland and Sweden, in addition to Norway, is actually a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, the Finns no longer have a coast really up there.
Right, because they gave that up to the Russians.
Yeah, and neither did the Swedes, but they are clearly engaged. The Chinese presence is striking. The Chinese have 3 icebreakers up there right now.
Yeah.
This is, of course, after we had gone out of the icebreaker business. I mean, absolutely. It's you can see that there's room for all kinds of skullduggery. It does have this, there are the question of economic roots. There's the question of the Russian build. They expect the Russian buildup in the Kola to be real. Of course, the very interesting talking to the Finns and the Swedes about how they think about conflict. For a long time, as you know better than anyone else, having been the ambassador there, the Finnish idea is, okay, we're ready for redoing the Winter War. They come charging at us, and Finnish snipers take them all out. And now they're realizing that no, they may have to provide covering fires, for example, for Estonia in the event of a war. The Swedes are expanding their military. It's happening slowly, but they're doing it. The Norwegians are doing the same. These countries essentially are merging their air forces, which actually makes them quite formidable, since they have a lot of F-35s. But it's just, you really sense that it's how powerful it is. And I guess another angle on that was talking to my Norwegian colleagues. They said basically the way we thought about security was always looking north, which is, of course, not how we think about NATO. I think Americans, Canadians, West Europeans have tended to think in terms of the inter-German border in the old days, and now the line of the Baltics. The Norwegians, understandably, because they until the Finns joined NATO, they were the only country with a border with Russia. Look north, but they said, now we're thinking east-west. How do we support the Finns and how do we support the Swedes? And there have even been exercises in which we take part, where people are thinking about, okay, how do you fight that kind of war? So there's a lot happening.
Finnish attitudes really are changing, and it's a big shift mentally for them. I mean, there was an old Finnish joke about national security in the Nordic area. And the joke was, well, Norway has NATO, Sweden has Finland, and Finland has a really long border with Russia.
Yeah.
So,
but there is the danger. I don't think it's a huge danger, but there is a danger. You can see that of kind of security thinking getting regionalized. That the Nordics just think about that angle. That said, there's enough to keep everybody perfectly busy, and the good news is even Norway, but Finland in particular and Sweden have robust defense industrial bases.
absolutely. And the Finns also, I mean, this is an adjustment for them because they've been used to since the Winter War when, there were these promises of assistance. Churchill said he was going to send forces through, Norway. They never arrived. The Finns have both out of pride, but also out of resentment, have said, we're going to rely on ourselves. We're going to defend ourselves. They're now having to get used to kind of being members of a 32 nation, alliance. But also another thing about Finns, which I learned when they had their first EU presidency after they joined the EU in the 90s when I was ambassador, is they always want to be first in class, and so they will work really hard at being a very good ally. And I think they're going to be big contributors to the alliance for the reasons you mentioned, but also just intellectually.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it's, I find the Swedes even more interesting because they've been neutral for so long. They don't have borders with anybody, although, they've been pushed around and probed by the Russians. So they're, again, people may want to take out their maps. They're remilitarizing Gotland, which is this big island in the middle of the Baltic, which is like a gigantic aircraft carrier, they had a big garrison there, and they basically pulled it out. These countries have conscription. The Norwegians have conscription. The way conscription works in Norway now is basically young men and women are eligible for conscription, but they only take volunteers. So you go through all the battery of tests, and then say, how would you like to sign up? And so they haven't actually had to bring people in against their will, but they can see that might happen. By the way, I want to say on board the cutter, it was a mixture of professionals and conscripts. They were very impressive. This was of course, this was a brand new ship, but it was immaculate. The young people you talk to, They believe in their mission. They were doing a lot of, they do a lot of dangerous stuff day in, day out, search and rescue in the high north. I will also say the food they had on board was amazing. They have they have like artisanal sourdough bread, fresh baked every day. And I bake bread, and I'm telling you, this was good. I bake sourdough artisanal breads. This was really good bread. Not to mention the smoked salmon and the
Yeah,
gravlax.
I was going to say, I'm sure that was great.
Yeah, I stay away from the sour herring, but
I want to. We're going to have to wrap up this segment, but I'm going to wrap it up by asking you: have you seen the joint Franco-Norwegian production on Netflix, Occupied?
oh, I well, I saw the first two seasons.
Yes.
So for our listeners, it was set in the idea is that Norway gets taken over by the Russians essentially at the behest of everybody else because they have some lunatic prime minister who's decided to stop exporting oil. But the first two seasons I thought were really well done, and it was sufficiently dark that at the end of the first season I was tempted to call my Norwegian friends and say, "Look, I think I can smuggle you out." I know people who know people.
Yeah, it's worth people taking a look at that actually, because it speaks, I think, to some of the attitudes you're talking about, now being fleshed out
Yeah.
in real life.
Well, it's in many ways it's very well acted and it's very well done. It is a sort of a surrogate for how they think about World War II.
Right.
And by the way, speaking of which, there's a wonderful movie which you can also get online called The King's Choice, which I commend to everybody. It was a Norwegian film about the first 3 days of the German invasion of Norway when the King Haakon, is trying to decide, does he go to Britain or not? And it's on the whole reasonably accurate. It's very well done in this sort of understated Norwegian way. And again, it harks back to the war. Last thing I would say is if anybody goes to Oslo, which is a beautiful city, it's really a lovely city, you should go to the Resistance Museum in the Akershus fortress. And I give them credit. They talk about collaboration.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Well, of course, they gave the name to the whole, practice of collaboration with Quisling.
Yeah.
Let's turn to your other activities besides voyaging to the far north. You have a new piece out in the Atlantic, which I want to commend to our listeners and viewers about what awaits a possible Kamala Harris presidency, and you basically say she's going to come in wanting to do all this stuff on domestic affairs, but like most presidents, she's going to end up having foreign affairs dictate to her a lot of what she ends up doing. Why don't you just kind of spell out the argument for our listeners?
So there really were three, maybe 4 points. First point is that what she's going to face is a world in which regional thinking about national security will probably no longer work. And that we really have to take on board the reality of an alignment, you can call it an axis, whatever you want to call it, between the bad guys, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And that means the threats are now global. I mean, so you can't say, well, Indo-PACOM is going to handle the Chinese. The Chinese are in Latin America, and that's not just trade. I was just talking, of course, about the Arctic. And by the way, China's not an Arctic country. And that we should assume that we're going to have hostility from all of these folks for different reasons, including very much the Russians who think that they're at war with us, even if we don't want to think that we're at war with them. And that's a sea change. Requires a major mind shift change. The second thing, and I plagiarize heavily from the work you and your colleagues did in the National Defense Commission, saying, you face the possibility of a real war with China. And I talk about, the things you've documented and things we've also documented at CSIS on the Chinese military industry, which is really on a war footing. They're just, I think, two of the biggest shipbuilders in China are merging so they can and they openly say this, so they can support defense industry more. This is really serious, and we haven't faced anything remotely like this in a very, very long time. And it's very different from the kind of wars we faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nobody wants a war like this, but there's enough built in terms of Xi's ambitions, how the Chinese view us, so on and so forth, that means she's got to face that. And to face that means you got to tackle the defense budget. And I really do rely heavily on the commission report saying, look, we're spending the same percentage of GDP on defense that we spent in 1999, and we ain't in a 1999 world. And, instead of 2.9 or 2.7% of GDP on defense, we probably need 4, maybe 5. It's that magnitude of threat. By the way, I point out in 1979, under Jimmy Carter, that 5% of GDP went to defense. We've forgotten that. Third point that I make is it's going to be critical how she staffs the administrations. And this is one where you probably feel particularly keenly, as I suppose do I, saying, look, the cadre of Democratic staffers that essentially you have available, so people 30 to, I say 50, but really 60, are people who have been, for the most part, been saying for a very long time now is, boy, was George W. Bush stupid. And, our motto is don't do stupid stuff. And the point is that I make is a sneer does not a foreign policy make. And that the consequences of this attitude that, boy, these guys are idiots because they tried to do too much has been to do way too little. A lot's going to depend on who she picks for subordinate positions. One thing that I really try to push is, first, the importance of having people with independent stature, sort of a Brzezinski or a Kissinger or a Bob Gates, those kinds of figures. I mean, Obama didn't listen to Bob Gates. So the other part of this has to be being willing to listen to those people. But then the other thing is encouraging her to do what she has said she would do, which would be to bring in a Republican. Now, frequently the pattern is you find a senior member of the opposing party and you make them in charge of the Department of Mess Kit Repairs. But, one of the better senators, or even say somebody like a Mike McCall in the House as either Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, or in an ideal world, Liz Cheney as Secretary of Defense. I just hope I didn't sink her chances. I think would be a very good move. But I do think this is going to be the first test we get of the presidency, whether she chooses to have close to her really powerful figures, particularly as those cabinet secretaries. And I think, I don't know what your view is. I think she'll probably keep Phil Gordon as her national security advisor. But
I'm certain. Yeah.
Yeah, but with all due respect to Phil, he is not a kind of forceful, let's put it this way. I knew Henry Kissinger, as did you. He's not Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, look, the thing about Phil Gordon, I think, is that he is, well within the sort of parameters of sort of the, internationalist consensus, liberal and conservative, more on the, sort of dovish liberal side. Definitely someone who has been affected by what you described earlier. He's essentially written, 2 books, one about the war on terror and one about, regime change in general, which I think, clearly overlearned whatever lessons one wants to, take from the Bush 43 experience. I've been struck by the fact that national security has factored almost not at all in the discussion and debate in this election campaign so far, except in the way that we tend to do, or the unserious way we tend to do in our politics, the ridiculous accusations, that are flying around in the wake of the really rather gross, a visit to Arlington by Trump, trying to turn Arlington National Cemetery into, a sort of a photo op for campaign ads. I mean, look, I yield to no one in criticizing the Obama administration for the debacle in Afghanistan. I was critical of the decision. I was critical of how they handled it as it happened. I've been critical retrospectively, but what's gone on in this exchange that's gone is just not serious discussion. I do wonder what you make of. I thought the Democratic National Convention was interesting in the sense that in the run up to her convention acceptance speech on Thursday of the DNC, Adam Kinzinger spoke. And, Adam is a pretty, hard headed Republican conservative internationalist. And then Leon Panetta spoke and quoted Ronald Reagan in his speech. And then Harris, in the only, not only, but one of the few moments where she actually talked about, national security and foreign affairs, did say, that she pledged to maintain the strongest, most lethal military, in the world. Now, that's nice. That's all rhetoric. We'll have to see what it's backed up with, as you say. As to quote President Biden, "Show me your budget, and I'll tell you what you really value." But those are all, I think, not bad auguries at any rate for the moment.
Yeah, no, I'm actually cautiously optimistic. I noted the same things. I agree with you. Phil is right in the middle of the general consensus. He's more of a Europeanist. I suspect he would actually be good on Ukraine. And I mean, I didn't mean to disparage him by saying he's not Henry Kissinger. I think you might get a national security advisor in him who actually would be more of a broker rather than Jake Sullivan, who's, I think, probably exercised way too much authority that really should be in the hands of the departments in terms of the shaping of foreign and defense policy. So that's okay. I agree. The mood music has been fine. I don't actually, it doesn't trouble me that this hasn't been part of the debate because honestly, this is in some ways, it's a very simple election. I mean, she's sort of center left of the Democratic Party and she's running against a very bad guy. And it's not that we argue about Trump's policies, really. We argue about his character, the people he has around him, everything that you and I have talked about.
Including so all I care running mate.
Yeah, well, there's that too. All I care about is that she wins, and I think they've decided that the way to win is to some extent, on mood music. I was impressed that she did not throw any real bones to the left wing of the Democratic Party at the convention. And I was struck by that word lethal. This is a point you've made to me a number of times. And I think it's right. She is a prosecutor, and that those folks do tend to see the world in terms of victims and perps. Their job is to go after the perps. So that is a good thing. I think she may. What we don't know is to what extent she has a sort of a legalist mindset. I always get a little bit twitchy when people talk about the rules-based international order. When one of the points I tried to make in the piece is it's actually an American-led international order. That's what's been the key to it. And it's been guaranteed and underwritten and shaped by American power. And the question is, do you think about it that way or in the more abstract sort of way that people refer to when they talk about a rules-based international order? But if she's running the campaign that way, if it works, more power to her. And I don't know where you are, but I'm certainly quite happy. Happy. I mean, I'll be voting for her and hoping that eventually there'll be a conservative party out there that I can
support
and,
with a clean conscience.
Yeah, I mean, it's
yes.
Did you have anything in mind in particular about J.D. Vance that was setting you off in particular?
Well, of course, his position on Ukraine has been awful, but he's basically, articulating fittingly, since he comes from Ohio, the Republican isolationist tradition of Robert Taft and John Bricker, which largely was buried in the Eisenhower years, and has now kind of resurfaced uh, in a particularly ugly way, including with a lot of the, as we've discussed in earlier podcasts with Jacob Heilbrunn and others, with a lot of the same kind of nationalist, anti-Semitic, ugly, xenophobic overtones that it's traditionally had. I think Trump had to work really hard to find someone, almost as loathsome as he is to run with, and he succeeded. So
Yeah. It's also I don't know if it was David French or Brett Stevens, one of the two, who noted this, that Vance does have a certain view of what conservatism is, and it's not one that we really adhere to, which is it's autochthony. This is a nation. It's not quite Blut and Boden, blood and land, but it's something
pretty
like
close in his convention address.
yeah. I mean, so we've been here many generations, and who are all these newcomers? When I'm always minded of FDR addressing the daughters of the American Revolution, fellow immigrants, um, and or Reagan on immigration. Um, that idea that we should have a concept of citizenship and national identity, which is you know really it's a European notion of nationalism. It's not the American one. It's not the nationalism of Lincoln. It's not that we are who we are because of the Declaration and the Gettysburg Address and all that. That's accessible to anybody who comes here and chooses to be a citizen. And I mean, in that respect, it's really retrograde. And unfortunately, I think there is a small, but not entirely insignificant coterie of right wing, I suppose I have to call them thinkers, who are putting that forward.
I'm not sure whether thinkers is really the right term, but yes, sadly, that is the reality.
Yeah.
I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I expect if she wins, I will have lots of policy disagreements. And I'll have an opportunity with you,
Well, plenty of
to,
stuff to talk about.
to exercise those comments and those criticisms. But what I won't worry about is that she might destroy the civil service, or try to overthrow the constitutional order. And so, yeah, for me, it's a pretty easy.
Yeah, for me too. I mean, or I would add to that, putting in, you don't have to worry that she would put into power people who are criminals
Right.
or,
Crazy.
crazy and, or in other ways radically unfit to hold some kind of place of public trust. I mean, for me, that's the scary thing. And you know what? I was thinking about this today. The thing that I find tragic about all this is if Trump were simply a kind of rude and crude businessman from New York, but who nonetheless had certain ideas and was not nuts and was not simply a grifter and was not trying to overthrow the elections. There's no question in my mind that the Republicans would have won probably, when he went for the reelect, or they'd be winning now.
Yeah. I think it's still a sort of center right country.
Yeah, I
And,
agree.
that, is kind of where the heart of the electorate is. It's one reason why I think the Vance choice was really a foolish one, because by all accounts, what he has done, much to his master's um, pleasure, apparently, according to reporting by Michael Bender in the New York Times, is appeal to the base and reinforce all the things that that the advantages Trump has, but also reinforces all his disadvantages and weaknesses.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the thing about Trump is he had one really good playbook, which he used in 2016. It came close to working in 2020, but it didn't work. And it's the same playbook, and I find it hard to believe it's going to work in 2024.
It's true. Let's turn to kind of a different form of performative politics, which did not occur here, but did occur in one of our closest allies, the UK. The decision by David Lammy to um, the new British Foreign Secretary in the Labour government to announce the suspension of, I think it was 35 licenses for British defense goods that were bound to Israel. Now, and the timing of this seems like it couldn't have been contrived to be worse by the Labour government. I mean, of course, Labour is under Keir Starmer, the new prime minister, is still recovering from, a deep flirtation with anti-Semitism in the Jeremy Corbyn years. There's still a lot of Brits who don't trust them despite their landslide victory. I mean, they won a landslide victory, got fewer votes than they did in the last election.
37% of the vote, let's remember, some such.
Right. So that's still a vulnerability for them. And they announced this literally on the day that the Israelis recover the bodies of 6 hostages, pretty brutally executed by Hamas. That's point one. Point two is that it seems to have been contrived for the kind of performative politics that we normally associate with our system, not theirs, right? Which is they excluded the F-35 from this because they clearly didn't want to, get in the way of those going to Israel. And so it's likely, that this is going to end up neither pleasing the pro-Palestinian, demonstrators who this is, ostensibly catering to. And of course, it will not at all please supporters of Israel, or likely the, supporters in the United States of the quote unquote special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. And as I understand it, although they were contriving it, I think, to have as little impact as possible, I've heard from defense industry that there are U.S. systems bound for Israel that have some of these UK components in them that that will be affected by this. So I just wonder what your take is.
Well, I mean, first I thought it was contemptible. I mean, I suspect it was gross incompetence in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that he announced this on the day that you have the funeral of Hirsch Goldberg, who was this dual citizen, American-Israeli, who had his arm blown off and who was sort of at the top, one of the people who was at the top of the list to be exchanged when his parents, who had spoken to the Democratic National Convention and are, heartrendingly appealing, were burying their son. And, Lammy makes this address, and it begins with this sort of smarmy, well, I'm a liberal progressive Zionist, which has echoes of some of my best friends are Jews. Please understand that. So I just thought it was odious, not because I think it was anti-Semitic, but because I thought it was stupid and shallow and contemptible behavior. When you have an ally that's fighting, or a friend, if you want to say that, that's fighting for their lives, to kick them at that moment, pretty despicable. Like I said, I suspect he's in over his head. And I think our, former colleagues at the FCO have a lot of people who are in over their heads too, and that if they didn't bother to think about this. I completely agree this is performative, but it makes me think in a deeper way, and I'd like to engage you on this. You and I have spent a lot of time in the UK. We dealt with it professionally together, and have continued to do so. I think we're both sort of Anglophiles, up to a point. And, I guess, I was reflecting, when the Brits are good, they're great. They're fantastic. And when the Brits are bad, they're very bad. They are like the French in that way. You have both Stanley Baldwin and Winston Churchill. In the present case, look, somebody who's not popular at all in the UK, for reasonable reasons, is Boris Johnson. Well, the fact of the matter is, on Ukraine, he was terrific, and the Brits led the way on Ukraine. They did it. They've done a number of things which caused us to follow them, supplying tanks, supplying long-range missiles, and then you have this. And in the same way that, this is a country that pioneered rule of law and freedom of speech and all that, and then you look at the other behaviors they're engaging in. I mean, if J.K. Rowling were not a world famous billionaire, I guarantee you she'd be looking at jail time for what she's had to say about gender. And actually, the UK is getting more and more restrictive on free speech. The kind of sort of censorship and cancel culture, it's worse than the United States. Even in the United States, there's some pushback. In the UK, there really is not, or there hasn't been any to speak of. And the problem is we need them. And they have great virtues. Their military still has daring, although it's way too small, underfunded. The British Army can maybe put a brigade in the field. A brigade. Even in 1914, before they had a draft, they could put 6 divisions in the field. So I worry about them. I worry about what kind of ally they're likely to be in this under this Labour government. But like I said, I had such a visceral reaction to the theater of this and to the callousness and stupidity of the timing that maybe I'm not thinking as straight as I usually do or try to do.
What's the old saying? It was worse than a blunder.
Yeah.
I, as you know, have been worried about the state of the special relationship for some time. And I think over time, well, I agree, we've needed the Brits. We don't need them quite as much as we might have in the past, because other allies have actually stepped up and done more to contribute. I mean, Australia, France, even Canada, not under this government, but under previous governments. So I think there's, there's an issue there. And I note that, there's a new defense review going on in Britain, and, all too often defense reviews in Britain have been sort of ex post facto rationales for, defense cuts and Britain doing less. We'll have to see what this one, it's under, George Robertson, who I think is a good man, is in charge of this one, along with Fiona Hill, former senior director for Russia on the US NSC staff, British born. And I think she's now chancellor of Durham University in Scotland. Northern England. I'm sorry. But it's pretty close to Scotland, but far from God. So
you have no idea how many angry.
Yeah, I know. I can just see the letters coming in now.
I want you all to know this is on Eric. I have nothing to do.
God, thank you, Eliot. But God knows what they're going to come up with under this review. But I mean, as you say, the British military is now a real shadow of it once was.
They've made some terrible choices, like these 2 aircraft carriers, which have been beset with all kinds of problems. They couldn't afford to buy the F-35s to put on them. I think they finally have some that they can put on. The British Army is down to about 75,000, 76,000. They continue. I mean, one of the mistakes I think they make is to continue to want to invest in the really big end items, which you can no longer do affordably unless you have a big export market or you have a huge internal market. And sometimes, you need to do both. So, they want to produce a successor tank to the Challenger 2, which it has its virtues, but it's not such a great tank. They'd be better off with Leopard 2s or M1s or Korean tanks, which are actually pretty good. They want to produce the next generation, I guess a 6th generation at this point, fighter plane. Why these 2 giant aircraft carriers, which, if you think about it, you cannot afford to send those into harm's way.
Right.
And the idea that you have vessels that you cannot afford to send into harm's way is lunacy.
Well, I mean, when you think about what we're doing in the Red Sea too, how many surface combatants does the Navy that ruled the waves once upon a time now have? 19, I think.
Yeah, it's fewer than 2 dozen. And their special forces are plucky and risk taking, and but when all that is said and done, it's not just that they've underspent, because they've tended actually to spend a bit above the NATO norm, and they're going to try to get up to 2.5%. I don't think they've spent it very wisely.
There's that, and there's the fact that for a very long time, to be fair to them, um, there was an appetite in political leadership for um, very forward use of British military power. I mean, under Tony Blair in Africa,
Yeah,
in Bosnia and Kosovo, and then of course in Iraq and Afghanistan. At the same time that the exchequer was continually cutting back the budget, so a lot of money got spent on operations.
yeah. And to be fair to them, they are forward deployed in the Baltic, um, and they are there. But I worry about that. I do worry about the tone of British society. I know maybe more than you do. I don't know, and maybe this just comes of subscribing to the Spectator. But I think the reason why the British have been able to exercise leadership, I believe, is because at the end of the day, there is still this hangover from World War II and from the Empire. And the more you denigrate all of the imperial heritage, which is complicated, I get that. But when you denigrate all of that, and you take down the statues of every single imperial statesman, and you say, well, Churchill really was a terrible guy because he didn't support Indian independence, then what they'll turn into is just a sort of a more fretful version of Ireland, which can't really commit to anything. The Irish are also in my black book these days, um, and that's a real danger, and they will stop contributing. One thing that always struck me about the official class in Britain, and I don't know if this is your experience, is they do care, or at least they did care what we think. Remember once when when we were in government, I had the somebody who who was the permanent undersecretary for defense, so the senior civil servant of the Defense Department, comes into my office with the defense attaché, and we're talking about Iraq. And in the middle of it, he just stops and looks at me and says, "Eliot, have you people lost confidence in us?" And I admired him for asking a very direct question. And after equivocating for about 30 seconds, I said, "Yes," because that was the case. He turned beet red, but we continued to discuss it. The defense attaché really turned red and veins standing out. So the next thing I know is 2 weeks later, I'm invited to his house for a dinner in honor of the visiting chief of the general staff. And he puts me right in front of him. And he says, "Eliot, would you mind telling General Walls exactly what you said to me?" And I said, "Do I really have to?" He said, "Yes, it's my dinner." So I did. And again, to his credit, there were some bulging veins, but luckily General Jack Keane was there and he came to my rescue. That's the Brits at their best, where you can have a really
Frank discussion. Yeah.
hard, frank discussion. And I admired them for that, because it can't be easy. But I worried that they could lose all that.
Yeah. As you know, I had very good relations with my UK counterparts and worked closely with them, including Peter Walls. Um, but I do worry about many of the things you do, the direction of British society, the way that they've, beggared the defense budget over a 30-year period now, and they're paying, the wages of that.
Yeah. And it's hard to see, by the way, how they spend their way out of it. I mean, they have this broken National Health Service. which, however it may have functioned in the past, can't function that way now. And, it is such a icon, particularly for a Labor government. They can't touch it.
We're kind of running out of time. We're running actually a little over time. But I think we should just touch at least briefly on Ukraine before we wrap up. So, I mean, just today, terrible strike in Poltava on a military base and a military institute. A lot of
In a
Ukrainian
hospital.
and a hospital. A lot of Ukrainian officers killed. I mean, we've seen, kind of two things going on over the last several weeks simultaneously. One, of course, is the incursion into Kursk, which was a bit of a surprise, to everybody, notably including the Russians. As a result, Ukrainians have taken a certain amount of Russian territory. The Russians don't seem to be in any hurry to try and take it back, and there seems to be a certain amount of confusion, I would say unclear lines of command and authority in Kursk, because some of it's FSB, some of it's the army, some of it's the Rosgvardia. So there's a lot of, sort of uncertainty about who's responsible, who's in charge, and who's going to do what to take some of this back. At the same time, you've seen kind of increasing advances in the Donbass, particularly towards Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Pokrovsk, keeps being described as this very important strategic, logistics hub. I mean, it is a logistics hub. I mean, it is a transportation, both road and rail crossroads. Phil OBrien over the weekend, I thought, did a very good job of explaining why, every one of these places that's fallen, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, now Pokrovsk, are strategic. And, it's a very bad use of the term, I think, as he demonstrates. And I think it's possible to overestimate what might happen if Pokrovsk actually falls. People also are not talking about the huge cost the Russians are incurring by these advances. But even Zelensky, says publicly that the situation at Toretsk and Pokrovsk is difficult, and that the Ukrainians are having trouble managing it. It's not clear. I mean, the Russians have seemed to have withdrawn some forces to go to Kursk, but those seem to have come from Kherson and Zaporizhia, not from the Donetsk area. So what do you make of all this?
Well, I was going to mention the Phil O'Brien piece because I thought Phil put his finger on it, that the word strategic gets misused terribly. I'm writing a book on strategy, as you know, and that's one of the things I want to rail a bit about. I mean, Bakhmut was strategic. Avdiivka was strategic. And I tend to agree with you here. I guess my feeling is one of the things that we're living through is a world which is very misleading because you have terrific commercially available overhead. You have the Telegram channels and mill bloggers, all of whom are commenting, and you just forget how much the fog of war continues to exist. So I kind of stick to the things that I think I know. So the things I think I know are, first, the Kursk operation, a huge boost for Ukrainian morale, a bit of a shock to the Russian system. It's hard to know how much of a shock, but in different ways, including conscripts getting killed or captured in substantial numbers, and the stain of a foreign invader driving German vehicles on Russian territory near Kursk, of all places, where there was a big World War II battle fought. That's there, and it's a demonstration of effect with the West of some sort. For the rest, the Russians are clearly prepared to feed enormous numbers of men into the machine. What we don't know is, at what point it becomes unsustainable for them too. It is unsustainable, I believe. I continue to think that I can't believe that the Russian elite overall is really happy with becoming a vassal state of China. I mean, just today, Putin is visiting Mongolia. And I would remind everybody that the Duchy of Muscovy spent 2 centuries being tax collectors for the Mongols back in I guess, the 14th and 15th centuries, is boasting about how his grandchildren all speak Chinese. Well, okay. But I'm not sure that how well that goes over. And then two other things. One is just one element, which is when the rains begin, as they will at some point in the next few weeks or month, maybe, it's going to be hard for everybody to move because, this part of the world has two muddy seasons, the Rasputitsa, I think it's called, where it's just really hard to move around because everything is like a couple of feet of gluey mud. And contrary to what you might think, tanks can't actually drive through mud that deep. So, there's that. And then there's the final big question, which I have to say I'm agnostic about, and that is the quality of Ukrainian war leadership. I've always thought Zelensky was a magnificently inspiring leader, certainly for his first couple of years for his own people. He was a magnificent spokesman for Ukraine to the outside world. I have to think all these guys, he's been firing a lot of people, probably some of whom needed to be fired, but I'm not sure all of them. I think he's tired. I think they're all tired. And, the question that I think all of us have to have is what is their theory of victory? I mean, we know what their maximum objectives are, which is liberate all of Ukrainian territory. I devoutly hope that can happen. Am I absolutely convinced? No. What about you?
I'm pretty much where you are. I'm still not quite sure what the theory of victory is. I do think they may have put themselves in a better position with the Kursk incursion for negotiation. But I think we're a long way from negotiation because I don't see any indication that Putin is interested in negotiating anything other than capitulation. So
it's, one thing I keep on reminding people is just how obscure everything will be at the end of World War One in 1918. And if you would ask people in, say, September of 1918, when the war would end, most of them would have said maybe a year from now. And in fact, the Allies had these huge plans called Plan 1919 for what they were going to do. And people were stunned when you have a whole series of events the last 3 weeks from second half of October to Armistice Day on November 11th, when it all kind of came crashing down. And something like that may happen this time as well.
Well, on that typically cheery note,
Right.
we will wrap up this episode of Shield of the Republic. Look forward to seeing you next week, Eliot. I hope I'm not going to announce our guest yet because we don't have it confirmed, but it should be a good conversation next week, and I'll see you then.
Yep. Look forward to it.